In a quiet village, where the air always carried the scent of pine, and the rustle of leaves seemed to hum with secrets, a young storyteller named Alara found herself drawn to something far older than her years. It wasn't just the creaking floorboards of her grandmother's attic, or the faint glimmer of dust caught in the sunlight that caught her attention. It was the book, an ancient, weathered tome with pages so brittle they seemed to whisper as she turned them. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as the stories within unfolded, the whispers grew clearer, as if the forest itself was speaking through the pages. Tales of forgotten gods, of legends that slumbered beneath the earth, and of warnings etched in ink that seemed to pulse with life. The village elder had always said some stories were meant to stay buried, but Alara couldn't resist. As she stepped into the shadow of the ancient forest, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the path ahead darker. What secrets lay hidden in those woods? And what would happen if she dared to wake what had been left asleep? Tonight, we'll follow Alara's journey, a tale of courage, curiosity, and the timeless pull of stories that refuse to stay silent. The deeper Alara wandered into the forest, the more the whispers seemed to wrap around her like a living thing, guiding her steps with an almost magnetic pull. The towering trees, their bark etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, loomed overhead like silent sentinels. Each step crunched softly against the forest floor, but beneath the sound, there was something else, a faint, haunting melody that seemed to drift on the air, neither close nor far, as if the forest itself were humming an ancient tune. It was beautiful, yet unsettling, and it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She paused, tracing her fingers over one of the carvings on a tree. The symbols were unlike anything she'd ever seen, spirals and lines that seemed to twist and shift when she looked at them too long. Were they warnings? Or perhaps a map, guiding her to something she wasn't yet ready to understand? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Was this a gift, a chance to uncover truths long forgotten? Or was it a curse, luring her into a place where no one was meant to tread? But Alara had never been one to shy away from questions. Her grandmother had always said she had the heart of a seeker, and now that heart wouldn't let her turn back. The forest seemed to sense her resolve, the air growing heavier, the light dimmer, as if the trees themselves were closing in around her. And then, at last, she saw it, a clearing where the ground was bare and the trees parted to reveal a circle of ancient stones. The stones were massive, their surfaces worn smooth by time, yet they stood with an eerie precision, as if placed by hands that knew secrets beyond human understanding. At the center of the circle lay a pool of water, its surface so still it looked like glass. But as Alara approached, her reflection didn't appear. Instead, the water shimmered, revealing the image of a figure lying as if in deep slumber. It was a face she didn't recognize, yet it felt strangely familiar, as though it belonged to a story she'd heard long ago. A voice rose from the pool, soft but commanding. "Turn back, child. What lies here is not for you to wake." The words hung in the air, heavy with warning, but Alara's curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She had come too far to leave without answers. Without hesitation, she reached out and dipped her hand into the water. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the forest seemed to vanish. Visions flooded her mind, images of a world older than time, of gods who walked among mortals, of battles fought in shadows and secrets buried beneath the earth. It was too much, too fast, and yet she couldn't look away. The whispers became a roar, the music a symphony, and the sleeping figure in the pool stirred ever so slightly, as if sensing her presence. What had she awakened, and what would it mean for her, for the village, for the world beyond the forest? The answers were there, just out of reach, but one thing was certain: Alara's journey had only just begun. The visions swirled around Alara like shards of a broken mirror, each fragment revealing a piece of a story that felt both ancient and alive. She saw towering figures cloaked in light, their faces etched with fury and sorrow, locked in a battle that shook the very earth. Mortals, small yet fierce, stood against them, their courage blazing like stars in the night. And then, the sealing, a moment of desperate sacrifice as the gods were bound, their power trapped beneath the earth to protect the world from their unchecked wrath. The whispers she had heard, those faint, haunting calls, were not the wind or the trees. They were the voices of the imprisoned gods, reaching out across time, begging for release. As the visions faded, the forest came back into focus, but Alara was no longer alone. Before her stood a figure, spectral and shimmering, its form shifting like mist in the moonlight. It spoke, its voice echoing with a weight that seemed to press against her chest. "I am the guardian of the seal," it said, its gaze piercing yet sorrowful. "You have seen what lies beneath. To awaken the gods is to unleash chaos upon the world. Their return would bring only ruin." Alara's mind raced, torn between the guardian's warning and the questions burning within her. Were the gods truly as monstrous as the visions had shown, or were they something more, beings whose power and passion had been feared, perhaps, but not fully understood? She thought of the whispers, the way they had drawn her here, not with malice, but with a strange, almost mournful longing. Could it be that they were not evil, but simply lost, sealed away for reasons that might no longer hold true? The guardian's voice broke through her thoughts. "Turn back, Elara. Some doors are meant to remain closed." But the words only stirred something deeper within her. She had always been drawn to stories, to the truths hidden beneath their surfaces. And now, faced with a mystery that could change everything, she couldn't simply walk away. The guardian's warning was clear, but so too was the pull of the unknown. What if the gods were not the villains of this story? What if they were something else entirely? Beings who had been silenced, not for the world's protection, but for its control. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Alara stepped forward. "I need to know more," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The guardian's form flickered, its expression unreadable, but it did not stop her as she turned and began to walk deeper into the forest. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, the air thick with the weight of secrets yet to be uncovered. She didn't know what she would find, or whether she could trust the whispers that had brought her here. But one thing was certain: Alara was no longer just a listener to these ancient tales. She had become a part of them, and whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it. The whispers didn't stop when Alara returned to the village. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent, as though the ancient voices had found a way to follow her home. They were no longer confined to the forest. They lingered in the creak of her cottage door, the rustle of parchment as she turned the pages of her grandmother's books, even the quiet hum of the wind outside her window. At first, she tried to ignore them, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the more she resisted, the more they seemed to press against her thoughts, urging her to listen, to understand. Determined to find answers, Alara threw herself into research. Days turned into nights as she combed through every book, scroll, and faded map she could find. The villagers watched her with growing unease, their whispers now matching those that haunted her. "She's changed," they murmured. "The forest has claimed her." Some even crossed the street to avoid her, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. The once welcoming community now felt like a cage, its walls closing in as their distrust grew. It wasn't long before the accusations began. "You've brought the darkness here," one villager spat, his voice trembling with anger. "The forest whispers because you've disturbed what should have been left alone." Elara tried to explain, to tell them about the visions, the guardian, the ancient gods whose voices called to her, but her words only deepened their fear. To them, she was no longer the curious storyteller they had known. She was a stranger, a harbinger of something they couldn't, or wouldn't understand. The isolation was unbearable. Even the children, who had once gathered eagerly to hear her tales, now avoided her, their parents pulling them close as she passed. Yet, despite the sting of their rejection, Alara couldn't silence the whispers. They were no longer just sounds, they were a pull, a call she couldn't ignore. And then, one day, she found it. Buried in the margins of an ancient text, barely legible, was a reference to a hidden temple deep within the mountains. The temple, the text claimed, held the key to understanding the gods and the seal that bound them. It was a place of power, of answers, and perhaps of redemption. The discovery ignited something in her, a spark of purpose that burned brighter than the villagers' mistrust. But with it came doubt. Could she truly leave everything behind? The village, her home, the few who still cared for her, the whispers didn't give her time to hesitate. They grew more urgent, their tone shifting from a plea to a demand. The temple was calling, and whether she was ready or not, Alara knew she had to answer. With a heavy heart, she packed what little she needed and prepared to leave. The village elder, the only one who didn't turn away, tried to stop her. "Some paths are not meant to be walked," he said, his voice trembling with age and worry. "The gods are not our friends, child. They are a force beyond our understanding." Alara met his gaze, her resolve steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I don't know if they're friends or foes," she replied, "but I can't ignore what's calling me, not anymore." As she stepped beyond the village's edge, the whispers softened, as if in approval. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers she couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a strange sense of peace. The temple awaited, and with it, the truth, whatever that might be. The journey would test her in ways she couldn't yet fathom, but Alara was ready. The whispers had chosen her, and now she would choose to follow them, no matter where they led. The path to the mountains was nothing like the forest Alara had known. The air grew thin, the ground uneven and treacherous, and the sky above seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from the weight of her pack, but from the growing sense that she was being watched. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, the kind that creeps in when you're alone in the wilderness. But then she saw them, shapes moving in the corners of her vision, shadows that seemed to flicker and twist in ways that defied nature. Creatures began to emerge, their forms strange and unsettling. Some were small, with glowing eyes and jagged teeth, skittering across the rocks like insects. Others were larger, their bodies cloaked in mist, their eyes hollow and ancient. They didn't attack, not at first. Instead, they circled her, their movements deliberate, as if testing her. The whispers grew louder in their presence, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as though the creatures were drawn to the whispers, or perhaps they were the whispers, given form. Alara couldn't be sure. As the days wore on, the encounters grew more frequent, more intense. One night, as she huddled by a meager fire, a creature unlike any she had seen before stepped into the light. It was tall, its skin pale and cracked like dried earth, and its eyes glowed with a cold, otherworldly light. It spoke, its voice a rasping echo of the whispers she had been hearing. "You cannot escape us," it said, its words sending a chill down her spine. "You carry the mark of the chosen. The gods will not let you go." Before she could respond, the spectral guardian appeared, its shimmering form materializing between Alara and the creature. "You are not welcome here," it said, its voice calm but firm. The creature hissed, its form dissolving into mist as it retreated into the darkness. The guardian turned to Alara, its expression unreadable. "You must be careful," it said. "The whispers are not your allies. They will use you to achieve their own ends." The warning lingered in her mind long after the guardian faded away. Was she being manipulated? Was this journey truly her choice? Or had the whispers been steering her all along? The questions gnawed at her, eroding the confidence she had once felt. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to think for herself. But now, surrounded by creatures that seemed to know her better than she knew herself, she began to doubt everything. The spectral guardian's appearances became more frequent, though its advice was always cryptic, leaving Alara to piece together its meaning. "Trust your instincts," it would say, or "the truth is not always what it seems." But how could she trust her instincts when they felt so clouded? How could she discern the truth when every step brought more questions than answers? The journey became a test, not just of her physical endurance, but of her resolve. Each encounter with the creatures, each cryptic word from the guardian, forced her to confront the uncertainty within herself. Was she chasing knowledge, or was she being led by forces she couldn't fully understand? The whispers offered no clarity, only more questions, their voices a constant presence in her mind. And yet, despite the doubt, despite the fear, Alara pressed on. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in clouds, and the temple. Her destination felt closer with every step. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't turn back. The whispers had chosen her, but now it was her choice to continue. The journey had become more than a quest for answers. It had become a battle for her own soul. The towering peaks of the mountains loomed above Alara as she finally reached the hidden temple. Its entrance was a sight to behold, a massive stone door, weathered by time yet standing defiant against the elements. Its surface was covered in intricate runes, their lines twisting and curling like the roots of ancient trees. The whispers, which had been her constant companions, now swelled into a deafening chorus, filling her ears and pressing against her mind. They were no longer just voices. They were a force, a presence that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. As she stepped closer, the runes began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. She traced her fingers over the carvings, her breath catching as she recognized the language. It was the same as the symbols in the forest, the ones that had guided her here. But these words were different, sharper, more urgent. They weren't just markings, they were a warning. Turn back, they seemed to say. Leave this place, or face the wrath of the sleeping gods. Elara's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of the words settled over her like a heavy cloak, and for a moment she froze. What if the villagers were right? What if she was walking into a nightmare of her own making? The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach that threatened to unravel her resolve. But then she thought of the visions, of the gods' voices that had called to her with such longing. Were they truly as dangerous as the runes suggested? Or was there more to their story, something the world had forgotten or misunderstood? The whispers grew louder, almost pleading now, urging her forward even as the runes warned her away. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady herself. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the reason she had left everything behind. She couldn't turn back now, not when she was so close to the truth. With trembling hands, she began to decipher the runes, her fingers moving quickly over the ancient script. Each symbol unlocked a piece of the puzzle, and as the final word fell into place, the stone door began to shift. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the air as the massive slab of stone slowly swung open, revealing the temple's dark interior. The air that rushed out was thick, heavy with the scent of age, and something else, something ancient and powerful. Alara hesitated at the threshold, her instincts screaming at her to stop, to leave this place and never look back. But the whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and they carried a strange sense of relief, as if they had been waiting for her. Stepping inside, she felt the weight of centuries press down on her. The walls of the temple were lined with more runes, their glow faint but steady, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered in the dim light. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and filling the space with a haunting melody. It was as though the temple itself was alive, its very stones holding the memories of a time long past. The deeper she ventured, the more the whispers began to take shape, forming words, fragments of sentences that she could almost understand. They spoke of betrayal, of a pact made in desperation, of a power too great to be controlled. And beneath it all, there was something else, a sorrow so profound it made her chest ache. The gods, it seemed, were not the monsters the runes had painted them to be. They were beings of immense power, yes, but also of deep emotion, their voices carrying the weight of countless years of isolation. Elara's steps faltered as she reached the heart of the temple. Before her stood a chamber, unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were lined with carvings that told a story of the gods' rise and fall, of their love for the world they had helped shape, and of the betrayal that had led to their imprisonment. At the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, its surface smooth and cold, and lying upon it was the figure she had seen in the visions. A god, their form still and silent, as if in deep slumber. The whispers fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Alara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her heart pounding in her ears. She had found what she was looking for, but now, faced with the reality of it, she wasn't sure if she was ready. The god before her was no longer just a story, a legend whispered in the dark. They were real, powerful, and waiting, and as she reached out, her hand hovering just above the altar, she knew that whatever happened next would change everything. For her, for the village, and for the world beyond. The chamber enveloped Elara in a silence so profound it felt like the world itself had paused to watch what she would do next. The air was thick with the scent of aged stone and something else, something ancient, like the faint memory of incense burned long ago. Around her, the walls were alive with murals, their colors faded but still vibrant enough to tell a story. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the carvings as if they could speak to her through touch. Each mural depicted a scene from a time long forgotten, gods walking among mortals, their forms radiant and towering, their expressions filled with love and pride for the world they had helped create. But as she moved deeper into the chamber, the images shifted. The gods' faces twisted in anguish, their hands raised in fury as mortals turned against them, their betrayal carved into the stone with brutal clarity. The whispers returned, clearer now, more urgent. They wove together into a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. They feared us, it said, the words carrying a weight that made Alara's chest tighten. They saw our power and called it a threat. They bound us, not out of necessity, but out of fear. The voice paused, as if letting the truth sink in. We are not your enemies, Elara. We are your creators, your protectors. Free us, and we will restore what was lost. Her heart raced as the words settled over her. The gods weren't monsters. They were beings who had been wronged, their power twisted into something dark by the actions of mortals. She thought of the villagers, their fear and mistrust, how quickly they had turned on her when she dared to question their stories. Was this what the gods had felt? Betrayed by those they had cared for, sealed away not for the world's safety, but for its control. Before she could respond, the spectral guardian materialized before her, its form shimmering like a mirage in the dim light. Do not listen, it said, its voice calm but firm. The gods' power is too great, their wrath too terrible. To free them would be to unleash chaos upon the world. Their madness is not your burden to bear. Its gaze bore into her, unyielding. Destroy the temple, Elara. Leave this place and let the past remain buried. The conflicting voices pulled at her, each one carrying its own truth, its own warning. The whispers promised restoration, a chance to right the wrongs of the past. The guardian spoke of duty, of the need to protect the world from forces it could not control. Alara stood at the center of the chamber, her mind racing, her heart torn between sympathy and fear. The murals stared down at her, their silent faces a reminder of the weight of her choice. She turned to the altar, where the sleeping god lay, their forms still and silent, yet radiating a power that made the air hum. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from pleading to commanding. "You are the chosen one," they said, "the one who can set us free. The one who can heal the world." The guardian stepped forward, its form flickering with urgency. "Do not be deceived, Elara. The gods' promises are not what they seem. Their power is a double-edged sword, and the cost of their freedom will be too great." Alara's hands trembled as she reached for the altar, her fingers hovering just above its surface. The air around her seemed to crackle with energy, the tension so palpable it felt like the temple itself was holding its breath. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts within her. The whispers and the guardian's warnings clashed in her mind, each one vying for her trust. But in the end, it wasn't about trust. It was about choice. Her choice. When she opened her eyes, the chamber seemed to shift, the murals glowing faintly as if in anticipation. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. The whispers had brought her here, but they would not decide her path. The guardian's warnings were clear, but they would not dictate her actions. This was her moment, her decision. And as she stood there, the weight of centuries pressing down on her, she knew that whatever she chose next would change everything, not just for her, but for the world beyond the temple's walls. The air in the central chamber was heavy, almost suffocating, as Alara stepped closer to the towering crystals that encased the slumbering gods. Their forms were majestic yet unsettling, frozen in stillness, their faces serene as if they were merely dreaming. But the whispers were anything but calm. They swirled around her like a storm, their voices merging into a single, overwhelming chorus. "Free us," they pleaded, their tone shifting between desperation and command. "Break the crystals, and we will restore what was lost. We will bring balance to a world that has forgotten its creators." Elara's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the smooth, cold surface of the nearest crystal. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, a mix of awe and fear, making her heart pound in her chest. She had come so far, pushed through so much, but now, faced with the reality of what lay before her, she felt the first flicker of hesitation. Could she truly be the one to decide the fate of these ancient beings, and by extension, the fate of the world? Before she could act, the spectral guardian materialized before her, its form shimmering with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Stop," it commanded, its voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "You do not understand what you are about to do." Its gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something in its eyes, a flicker of emotion, of pain. "I was once like you," it said, its tone softening. "A mortal, filled with curiosity and hope. I helped seal the gods away, believing it was for the greater good. And I have spent centuries guarding this temple, ensuring their slumber remained undisturbed." Alara's breath caught. The guardian's words struck a chord deep within her, forcing her to confront the enormity of what she was considering. "But the world has changed," she argued, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Maybe the gods have too. Maybe they deserve a second chance, a chance to prove they're not the monsters we've been told they are." The guardian's form flickered, its expression hardening. "You speak of change, but power does not change," it said, its voice rising. "The gods' power is absolute, their will untamed. To free them is to unleash chaos upon a world that is no longer prepared to face them. Do you truly believe you can control what you set free? The tension between them crackled like static in the air, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if they sensed the conflict within her. Elara's mind raced, torn between the Guardian's warning and the god's promises. She thought of the murals, of the love and pride the gods had once shown for the world. But she also thought of the betrayal, of the fear that had driven mortals to seal them away. Could there be a middle ground, a way to free them without unleashing destruction? The Guardian stepped closer, its form casting a faint, eerie glow. "You have a choice, Alara," it said, its voice low and urgent. "But remember this, once the crystals are shattered, there is no turning back. The consequences will be yours to bear, and the world's to suffer." Alara's gaze shifted between the Guardian and the crystals, her heart pounding as the weight of her decision settled over her. The whispers pressed against her mind, their voices a cacophony of hope and fear, while the Guardian's warning echoed in her thoughts. She had come seeking answers, but now, faced with the reality of her choice, she realized there were no easy answers, only questions and the weight of what came next. Her hand hovered over the crystal, the air around her crackling with energy. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, the murals glowing faintly as if awaiting her decision. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Whatever she chose, she knew it would change everything, not just for her, but for the world beyond the temple's walls. And as she stood there, the whispers and the Guardian's warnings pulling her in opposite directions, she knew one thing for certain: the moment of truth had arrived. Alara's breath steadied as she made her choice. The whispers, the visions, the warnings, they all faded into the background as she focused on the task before her. The gods had been wronged, their power misunderstood, and she believed their wisdom could heal the fractured world. With a determined resolve, she raised her hand and brought it down sharply against the surface of the nearest crystal. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that reverberated through the chamber like thunder. The crystal shattered, its shards scattering across the stone floor, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the air shifted. A low hum filled the chamber, growing louder and louder until it became a roar. The other crystals began to crack, spider webs of light spreading across their surfaces. One by one, they exploded, releasing bursts of radiant energy that filled the room with an almost blinding glow. Alara shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as the gods began to stir. Their forms, once still and frozen, now pulsed with life, their eyes opening to reveal a light so intense it seemed to pierce through her very soul. At first, the gods appeared grateful, their voices a harmonious blend of awe and relief. "You have freed us," they said, their words resonating with a power that made the ground tremble. "We will restore what was lost, and the world will know peace once more." Elara felt a surge of hope, a fleeting moment of triumph, as she believed she had made the right choice. But that hope was short-lived. The god's power, so long contained, began to overflow. The chamber shook violently, stones falling from the ceiling, as the temple itself seemed to rebel against their awakening. The air grew thick with energy, crackling and snapping like a storm unleashed. Elara stumbled back, her earlier confidence giving way to fear. The gods' forms grew larger, their presence overwhelming, and their voices, once comforting, now carried a weight that threatened to crush her. "You have done well," they said, their tone shifting, "but you cannot comprehend what we must now do." Panic surged through her as the realization hit. The whispers hadn't been guiding her to the truth. They had been manipulating her, using her to free the gods for their own ends. She had been a pawn in a game far beyond her understanding. The temple groaned, its ancient walls crumbling under the strain of the gods' unleashed power. Alara turned to run, but the way was blocked by falling debris. She was trapped. Just as despair began to take hold, the spectral guardian appeared, its form flickering with urgency. "This is not your fate," it said, its voice cutting through the chaos. "You must leave now." Before she could protest, the guardian moved between her and the collapsing temple, its form expanding to shield her from the falling stones. "Go," it commanded, its voice firm but filled with sorrow. "The gods' power is too great for you to face alone. I will hold them back as long as I can." Alara hesitated, guilt and fear warring within her. She had made this choice, and now others were paying the price, but the guardian's gaze was unyielding. "This is not the end," it said, its voice softening. "You have a greater role to play, but you must survive to fulfill it. Go, and do not look back." With a final, heart-wrenching glance, Elara turned and ran, the temple collapsing around her as the guardian's light flared behind her, a last stand against the gods' overwhelming power. The path was treacherous, the ground shaking and the air thick with dust, but she pressed on, driven by a mix of desperation and determination. As she burst out into the open air, the temple behind her gave one final, thunderous groan before collapsing into rubble. Alara stood at the edge of the ruins, her breath ragged, her mind reeling. The gods were free, their power now unleashed upon the world, and she had been the one to set them loose. The whispers had fallen silent, but their absence brought no comfort. She had gambled on the gods' wisdom, and now she would have to face the consequences of that gamble alone. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers she couldn't yet imagine, but one thing was clear: her journey was far from over. The world had changed, and so had she. And whatever came next, she would have to find a way to make it right. As Alara stepped away from the ruins of the temple, the world around her seemed to recoil in response to the gods' awakening. The once bright sky had turned a deep, unsettling shade of indigo, streaked with veins of light that pulsed like an open wound. The ground beneath her feet trembled faintly, as though the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the gods' unrestrained power. Trees swayed unnaturally, their branches twisting as if caught in an invisible storm, and the air carried a metallic tang, sharp and electric. It was as if reality itself had been thrown into chaos, the natural order unraveling at the seams. Alara's heart ached with guilt, a heavy knot in her chest that refused to loosen. She had believed she was doing the right thing, that freeing the gods would bring balance and healing. But now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that she had made a terrible mistake. The whispers that had guided her here were gone, leaving only silence, a silence that felt louder than the chaos around her. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought back the wave of despair, threatening to overwhelm her. There was no time for regret. The gods were free, and their power was already reshaping the world in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. If she wanted to undo what she had done, she would need to act quickly. Her mind raced as she tried to recall the fragments of knowledge she had gathered, the ancient texts, the cryptic warnings, the stories of the artifacts used to seal the gods away. If those artifacts still existed, they might be the key to restoring the balance she had disrupted, but finding them wouldn't be easy. The artifacts were ancient, scattered across the land, their locations long forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars. And even if she could locate them, she had no idea how to use them. The task ahead felt insurmountable, but Alara knew she had no choice. She had set this chain of events in motion, and now it was her responsibility to try to fix it. The land around her seemed to mirror her turmoil. The once familiar paths were now twisted and unrecognizable, the landmarks she had relied on distorted or destroyed. The mountains loomed larger, their peaks jagged and menacing, while the rivers ran black, their waters sluggish and lifeless. Even the air felt heavier, pressing down on her with an almost physical weight. Every step was a struggle, but Alara pressed on, driven by a determination she hadn't known she possessed. As she walked, her mind wandered to the stories she had heard as a child, tales of heroes who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. She had always loved those stories, but now, as she found herself living one, they felt less like inspiration and more like a cruel reminder of how unprepared she was. Heroes in stories always seemed to know what to do, but Alara felt lost, her path uncertain, and her choices fraught with danger. Yet, despite the fear and doubt, she refused to give up. The world was counting on her, even if it didn't know it yet. The first step, she decided, was to return to the village. It was the only place she knew where she might find clues about the artifacts, or at least, someone who could point her in the right direction. But as she approached, her heart sank. The village was in ruins, its once proud buildings reduced to rubble, the streets eerily silent. The villagers were gone, their absence a stark reminder of the devastation the gods' awakening had caused. Alara's guilt deepened, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. She began to search through the remains, her hands trembling as she sifted through the debris. It felt like an invasion, digging through the remnants of a life that had been torn apart, but she had no other choice. After what felt like hours, she found it, a weathered scroll, partially buried beneath a fallen beam. Her breath caught as she unrolled it, her eyes scanning the faded text. It was a map, its edges frayed and its markings barely legible, but it was enough. The artifacts were marked, their locations scattered across the land like pieces of a puzzle. Alara's resolve hardened as she studied the map. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but she had no other choice. The gods' power was growing, and with it, the chaos they unleashed. She had to find the artifacts, no matter the cost. The whispers were gone, the guardian's warnings silenced, and the weight of her decision rested solely on her shoulders. But as she rolled up the map and set off into the unknown, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. The ruins of the ancient city rose before Alara like the bones of a forgotten giant, their jagged silhouettes cutting against the darkened sky. Once a place of grandeur and life, It now stood as a haunting reminder of a time long past, its crumbling walls and shattered towers barely holding together under the weight of centuries. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and alive, like the breath of a slumbering beast. This was where she believed the first artifact lay hidden, a relic of immense power that could help undo the chaos she had unleashed. But as she approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that the city itself was watching her, its hollow windows like unblinking eyes. The journey to the ruins had been anything but easy. The land, once familiar and welcoming, had become a twisted reflection of itself, each step a reminder of the gods' growing influence. Rivers ran backward, trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the sky seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. And then there were the people, those who had survived the initial wave of destruction. She encountered them along the way, their faces etched with fear and anger. Some recognized her, their eyes narrowing with accusation. "You did this," one man spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You woke them, and now we're paying the price." Elara tried to explain, to tell them she was trying to fix what she had broken, but her words fell on deaf ears. The hostility was palpable, a wall of distrust she couldn't climb. It stung, but she couldn't blame them. She had made her choice, and now they were all living with the consequences. The weight of their judgment sat heavily on her shoulders, a constant reminder of her guilt. Yet, amidst the anger and fear, she began to notice something else, a spark of resilience. In the eyes of a child who still played despite the chaos, in the quiet determination of a woman rebuilding her home, Alara saw a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, but it was there, and it reminded her why she couldn't give up. As she finally reached the outskirts of the ruins, she was met with an unexpected challenge. The city was protected by powerful wards, their energy crackling in the air like static before a storm. The ground was marked with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light, and the air hummed with a low, ominous tone. It was clear she couldn't simply walk in. The wards were designed to keep intruders out, their magic ancient and formidable. But Alara had spent her life deciphering stories, and she knew that every puzzle had a solution. She just had to find the key. The first puzzle revealed itself as she approached the crumbling gates. A series of runes was etched into the stone, their patterns forming a complex web of lines and curves. At first glance, they seemed random, but as she studied them, she began to see a pattern, a story told in symbols. It was a tale of creation and destruction, of balance and chaos, and at its heart was a single rune that seemed to pulse with energy. She traced her fingers over it, her breath catching as the symbol lit up beneath her touch. The gates groaned, their ancient mechanisms creaking to life, and slowly they began to open. But the victory was short-lived. Beyond the gates lay another puzzle, this one even more intricate. The path ahead was lined with statues, their stone eyes staring blankly ahead. Each statue held a different object, a sword, a harp, a scale, and at the center of the path was a pedestal with a single empty slot. Alara's mind raced as she tried to decipher the meaning. The objects seemed to represent different aspects of life: strength, harmony, justice. But which one was the key? She moved to the statue, holding the harp, her fingers brushing the strings. The air vibrated with a soft, melodic hum, but nothing happened. Next, she tried the scale, its balance perfect and still. Again, nothing. It was only when she reached the sword that she felt a shift. The moment her hand touched the hilt, the air around her seemed to sharpen, the weight of the blade heavy with purpose. She hesitated, then carefully lifted it from the statue's grasp. The moment she did, the pedestal at the center of the path lit up, its surface glowing with the same rune she had seen on the gates. With a deep breath, she placed the sword into the slot. The ground trembled, the statues coming to life as their stone forms shifted and stepped aside, clearing the path forward. Alara's heart pounded as she stepped through, the ruins of the city stretching out before her. She knew the challenges ahead would only grow harder, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: confidence. The artifacts were out there, and she would find them. The world might be broken, but it wasn't beyond repair, and as long as she kept moving forward, there was still a chance to make things right. The air inside the ruins was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and the faint tang of something metallic. Alara's footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the labyrinthine corridors, her torch casting flickering shadows on the cracked walls. The deeper she ventured, the more the ruins seemed to close in around her, their ancient stones whispering secrets she could almost understand. It was as though the city itself was alive, its heartbeat a low, steady hum beneath her feet. And then she saw it, a faint glow emanating from a chamber at the end of the hall. Her breath caught as she stepped inside, her eyes widening at the sight before her. At the center of the room, resting on a pedestal carved with intricate runes, was a staff. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. The staff pulsed faintly, a rhythmic glow that matched the hum she had felt earlier. This was it, the first artifact, the key to binding the gods. Alara's heart raced as she approached, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to grasp it. But the moment her fingers closed around the staff, the chamber erupted into chaos. The ground beneath her feet shook violently, the walls groaning as cracks spider-webbed across their surfaces. The air grew thick with a suffocating energy, and a voice, cold, mocking, and familiar, filled the space. Do you truly believe you're worthy of this power? It asked, its tone dripping with disdain. Alara spun around, her grip tightening on the staff as a figure materialized before her. It was her, or at least a twisted reflection of herself. The manifestation's eyes burned with accusation, its voice sharp and cutting. You freed the gods out of arrogance, thinking you knew better than those who came before you. And now the world burns because of your recklessness. Alara's chest tightened, the words striking a nerve she hadn't realized was so raw. The manifestation stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its words a relentless assault. You were a fool to think you could fix what you broke. What makes you believe you can undo the damage you've caused? The questions echoed in her mind, each one chipping away at her resolve. For a moment, she faltered, the weight of her guilt threatening to crush her. But then, something inside her shifted. She thought of the villagers, the survivors she had encountered on her journey. Their anger, their fear, but also their resilience. She thought of the guardian, who had sacrificed itself to give her a chance to make things right. And she thought of the gods, their voices filled with sorrow and longing, their power a force she could no longer ignore. The manifestation's words were harsh, but they weren't entirely wrong. She had made mistakes, grave ones, but those mistakes didn't define her. What defined her was what she chose to do next. "You're right," Alara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. "I was reckless. I was arrogant, but I'm not going to let that stop me from trying to fix what I've done." The manifestation sneered, but Alara stood her ground, her grip on the staff firm. "I've made mistakes, but I've also learned from them, and that's why I won't back down. Not now, not ever." The chamber fell silent, the manifestation's form flickering as if undone by her words. The ground steadied, the cracks in the walls sealing themselves as the air cleared. The staff in her hand glowed brighter, its power resonating with her own resolve. She had faced her doubts, her fears, and emerged stronger for it. With the artifact in hand, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity she hadn't known before. The road ahead was still long, and the challenges would only grow greater, but she was ready. The first step had been taken, and Alara knew she wouldn't stop until the balance was restored. Elara's journey led her to a sacred grove, a place where the air felt alive, humming with an energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the earth itself. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching skyward like the fingers of giants. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and blooming flowers. It was a place of beauty, but also of mystery, a sanctuary guarded by forces far older and wiser than she could comprehend. This was where the second artifact was said to be hidden, and Alara knew she would have to earn it. As she stepped into the grove, the atmosphere shifted. The gentle hum of life grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, as if the forest itself was watching her. Then a voice echoed through the grove, deep and resonant, its tone both commanding and serene. "Who dares enter this sacred place?" it asked, the words reverberating through the air like the tolling of a bell. Elara froze, her heart racing as a figure emerged from the shadows. A spirit, its form shimmering like mist caught in sunlight. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its presence filled the grove with an energy that made the very ground tremble. The spirit's gaze bore into her, its voice calm but firm. "This grove is a place of balance, where power is tempered by wisdom. Those who seek what lies here must prove their worth. Tell me, traveler, what do you value most, power or harmony?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Alara felt the weight of it settle over her. She had come seeking an artifact, a tool to help her undo the chaos she had unleashed, but the spirit's challenge was deeper than that. It wasn't just about what she wanted, it was about who she was. Alara took a deep breath, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't falter. "I've made mistakes," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I sought power without understanding the cost, and I've seen the damage that comes from imbalance. But I don't want power anymore. What I want is to restore harmony, to fix what I've broken and bring the world back to the way it should be." The spirit's gaze didn't waver, but its expression softened ever so slightly. "Words are easily spoken," it said, its tone probing. but actions reveal the truth. Show me, Alara, that you are worthy of the artifact you seek. The challenge was clear, and Alara knew there was no turning back. She had to face the consequences of her choices, not just for herself, but for the world. The spirit raised its hand, and the grove seemed to shift around her. The trees blurred, their forms twisting and reforming, until she found herself standing in a place that was both familiar and strange. It was the village, but not as she remembered it. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. The spirit's voice echoed in her mind. This is what your actions have wrought. A world out of balance, its people lost and afraid. Can you face it, Elara? Can you bear the weight of what you've done? She stepped forward, her heart heavy with guilt, but her resolve unshaken. She walked through the ruined streets, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and with each step, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. But she didn't look away. She faced it all, the fear, the anger, the despair, and as she did, she began to understand. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a lesson. The spirit wasn't testing her to break her, it was testing her to make her stronger. When the vision faded, Alara stood once more in the grove, the spirit before her. Its gaze was softer now, its voice gentle. You have faced the truth of your actions, and in doing so, you have proven your worth. The artifact you seek is yours. The spirit gestured to a small pool of water at the center of the grove. As Alara approached, she saw that it wasn't just water. It was a mirror, its surface still and perfect. The artifact was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its frame, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The spirit's voice echoed once more. This mirror reflects the true nature of those who gaze into it. Use it wisely, for the final artifact will not be so easily obtained. Alara nodded, her grip tightening on the mirror as she felt its power resonate with her own. The spirit's warning lingered in her mind, a reminder that the road ahead would only grow harder, but she was ready. She had faced her doubts, her fears, and emerged stronger for it. With the second artifact in hand, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity she hadn't known before. The journey was far from over, but Alara knew she wouldn't stop until the balance was restored. The realm between worlds was a place of impossible beauty and terrifying unpredictability. It was said to exist in the thin veil that separated reality from myth, a place where time bent and space folded in on itself. The final artifact, the key to sealing the gods once more, lay hidden there, but reaching it was no simple feat. The portal to this realm appeared only during a lunar eclipse, a fleeting window of opportunity that Alara could not afford to miss. As the night of the eclipse approached, the air grew heavy with anticipation, the moon hanging low and bright in the sky, its edges already beginning to darken. Elara stood at the edge of a vast, open plain, her heart pounding as she scanned the horizon. The artifacts she had gathered, the staff and the mirror, pulsed faintly at her side, their power a constant reminder of the stakes. She knew the gods were watching, their presence a shadowy weight pressing against her thoughts. They had sensed her intent, her plan to undo what she had set in motion, and they would stop at nothing to prevent it. The chase was on, and every moment counted. As the first sliver of shadow crossed the moon, the portal began to form. It shimmered into existence like a tear in the fabric of the world, its edges rippling with an otherworldly light. Alara didn't hesitate. She ran, her boots pounding against the earth as the portal grew larger, its energy crackling in the air. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, the ground trembled, and the air filled with the sound of thunder. The gods were coming. The first to appear was a towering figure cloaked in light, their form shifting and shimmering like molten gold. Their voice boomed across the plain, a sound that made the very air vibrate. "You cannot escape us, Elara," they said, their tone both commanding and mournful. "You brought us back, and now you seek to undo your own work. Do you truly believe you can outrun the inevitable?" Alara didn't answer. She couldn't afford to waste breath or time. Her mind raced as she ran, her hand gripping the staff tightly. She had to think, to outwit the gods who pursued her. The portal was close now, its light blinding, but the gods were faster. A burst of energy shot past her, narrowly missing her shoulder and scorching the ground. She ducked instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. Another burst followed, closer this time, and she knew she couldn't outrun them forever. She needed a plan. As the next burst of energy crackled toward her, she spun, raising the staff. Its power surged, forming a shield that deflected the attack. The force of it sent her stumbling backward, but she didn't stop. She reached for the mirror, its surface shimmering as she held it up. The reflection caught the light of the portal, and for a moment, the gods hesitated. The mirror's power was unpredictable, a weapon they couldn't fully understand, and that uncertainty bought her precious seconds. With a final burst of speed, Alara reached the portal. The light engulfed her, the world around her dissolving into a blur of color and sound. But as she stepped through, she felt a hand grab her wrist, cold and unyielding. One of the gods had caught her, their grip like iron. "You cannot escape," they said, their voice echoing in the void, but Alara wasn't ready to give up. She twisted, her free hand gripping the staff, and thrust it forward. The energy surged, forcing the god to release her. She stumbled through the portal, the world around her shifting and reforming as she entered the realm between worlds. The portal snapped shut behind her, the gods' voices fading into silence. Alara stood alone, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the artifacts glowing faintly in her hands. She had made it, but the gods were close, their presence a shadowy threat just beyond the veil. The final artifact was within reach, but the challenge ahead was far from over. The realm between worlds was a place of chaos and wonder, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, and somewhere within its shifting landscapes, the final piece of the puzzle awaited. Alara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. The gods might be relentless, but so was she, and in this strange, impossible realm, anything could happen. The realm between worlds was unlike anything Alara had ever experienced, a place where time itself seemed to unravel, and the laws of nature held no sway. The sky above shimmered with hues of gold and violet, while the ground beneath her feet shifted unpredictably, as though the earth itself couldn't decide whether to be solid or liquid. Every step felt like a gamble, the air thick with an energy that buzzed against her skin. This was the final frontier, the last barrier between her and the artifact she sought. The crown, the key to sealing the gods, was said to be hidden here, guarded by a being as ancient as the stars themselves. As she pressed forward, the landscape began to shift more dramatically. Trees twisted and bent, their branches reaching out like grasping hands, and rivers flowed upward, defying gravity in a way that made her head spin. The whispers of the gods, faint but persistent, seemed to echo all around her, their voices no longer pleading or commanding, but almost. Curious, they were watching, waiting to see what she would do next. But Alara was too focused to linger on their presence. She had come too far to falter now. It wasn't long before she found herself standing before a massive archway, its surface carved with symbols that pulsed faintly with light. Beyond it lay a vast, open space, and at its center stood the being she had been warned about. It was neither human nor god, but something in between, a figure of shifting light and shadow, its form constantly changing, as if it couldn't decide whether to be solid or ethereal. Its eyes, deep and ancient, locked onto hers, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine. This was the guardian of the crown, a being that embodied the very balance of creation and destruction. "Why do you seek the crown?" the being asked, its voice a harmonious blend of calm and authority. "Do you believe yourself worthy to wield such power?" Alara took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the staff and mirror she carried. "I seek it to restore balance," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the being's gaze. "The god's power is unchecked, and the world suffers because of it. I must seal them away before it's too late." The being tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "And what if sealing them is not the answer? What if their power, though dangerous, is necessary? The world thrives on balance, Elara, creation and destruction, light and shadow. These forces are not meant to be separated." Alara hesitated, the being's words stirring doubts she had tried to suppress. She had seen the destruction the gods had wrought, but she had also glimpsed their sorrow, their longing. Were they truly beyond redemption, or had they been misunderstood, their power feared rather than understood? For a moment, she wavered, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. But then she thought of the villages in ruins, the lives shattered by the gods' unrestrained power. She thought of the guardian, who had sacrificed itself to give her a chance to make things right. And she thought of the mirror, the artifact she had earned by facing the truth of her own mistakes. The god's power might be necessary, but it was also dangerous, too dangerous to be left unchecked. "I understand the need for balance," she said, her voice firm, "but the god's power has tipped the scales too far. If I don't act, the world will be lost. I have to seal them away." The being studied her for a long moment, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. Finally it nodded, its expression softening ever so slightly. "Your resolve is strong, and your heart is true. I will grant you the crown, but know this: wielding its power will come at a great cost. The crown does not merely command the gods, it binds the one who wears it. Are you prepared to bear that burden?" Alara's breath caught, the weight of the being's warning settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had known this journey would demand sacrifices, but this was something else entirely. To wear the crown was to bind herself to it, to carry its power and its consequences for as long as she lived. It was a price she hadn't fully considered, but one she couldn't afford to refuse. With a deep breath, she nodded. "I'm ready." The being extended its hand, and the crown materialized before her, its surface gleaming with an otherworldly light. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, its intricate design etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Alara reached out, her fingers brushing against its surface, and the moment she touched it, she felt its power surge through her, a force so immense it nearly knocked her off her feet. The being's voice echoed in her mind as she placed the crown on her head. "Remember, Elara, the crown is a tool, but it is also a test. Use it wisely, or it will consume you." The weight of the crown settled firmly on her brow, its power humming in her veins. Alara felt a strange sense of clarity, as though the world had shifted into sharper focus. The gods' whispers grew louder, their voices filled with a mix of anger and fear. They knew what she carried, and they knew what it meant. The final battle was coming, and Alara was ready. She had the crown, but she also had the cost, a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. The journey had brought her here, to the edge of the impossible, and now there was no turning back. The gods would be sealed, but at what cost, only time would tell. The moment Alara stepped back into the mortal world, she was met with chaos. The sky churned with unnatural storms, lightning crackling in jagged streaks across a blood-red horizon. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of destruction. Villages lay in ruins, their streets empty and silent, while rivers ran black, their waters poisoned by the gods' unrestrained power. It was a world unraveling, its balance shattered by forces too great to control. Alara tightened her grip on the artifacts, their weight a constant reminder of the task ahead. She had returned with the tools to set things right, but the gods would not go quietly. The first god to appear was a towering figure cloaked in flames, their form shifting and writhing like a living inferno. Their voice boomed across the landscape, a sound that shook the very earth. "You dare challenge us, Alara?" they roared, their eyes blazing with fury. "We are the creators, the destroyers, the eternal. You cannot hope to contain us." Alara stood her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She raised the staff, its power surging to life as it formed a barrier of light around her. The mirror in her other hand caught the god's reflection, its surface shimmering as it amplified the staff's energy. The battle began in earnest, the god's flames crashing against her shield in waves of searing heat. Each strike pushed her to her limits, her arms trembling under the strain, but she held firm. She had come too far to falter now. As the fight raged on, the gods' tactics shifted. Their fury gave way to cunning, their voices softening as they sought to sway her. "You could wield our power," one god whispered, their voice echoing in her mind like a siren's song. "Imagine the knowledge you could possess, the greatness you could achieve. Join us, and the world will bow before you." The offer was tempting, a fleeting thought of what it might be like to stand above the chaos rather than fight against it. But Alara shook her head, her grip on the artifacts tightening. "I don't want power," she said, her voice steady. "I want balance, and I won't let you destroy the world to get it." Her defiance only fueled their anger. The gods unleashed their full might, their attacks coming faster and harder, each one more devastating than the last. Alara's strength waned, her body aching from the relentless assault, but she refused to give in. She had faced her doubts, her fears, and emerged stronger for it. This was the final test, and she would not fail. With a surge of determination, she raised the crown, its light blazing brighter than ever before. The artifacts resonated with one another, their combined power creating a force that even the gods could not withstand. The air crackled with energy as the crown's light enveloped the gods, their forms flickering and fading as they were drawn into its grasp. The effort was immense, every fiber of her being straining under the weight of the artifact's power. But she held on, her resolve unyielding, until at last the gods were sealed away once more. As the light faded and the world fell silent, Elara collapsed to her knees, her strength utterly spent. The artifacts lay lifeless beside her, their power drained, but their purpose fulfilled. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, their voices filled with gratitude. "Thank you," they said, their words a gentle echo in her mind. "You have restored the balance." For a moment, Alara allowed herself to breathe, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her heart filled with a quiet sense of triumph. The world was scarred, but it was healing. The gods were sealed, their chaos contained, and the whispers that had guided her for so long finally fell silent. She had done what she set out to do, but the cost had been great. The crown's burden now rested on her shoulders, a reminder of the power she had wielded and the sacrifices she had made. As she looked out over the horizon, the first rays of dawn breaking through the storm-torn sky, Alara knew her journey was far from over. The world had been changed, and so had she. But for now, in the quiet of the morning, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The whispers were gone, but their message lingered, a testament to her courage, her strength, and the balance she had fought so hard to restore. As the last traces of the god's power faded into the crown, the world seemed to exhale. The storm-ravaged skies began to clear, the oppressive weight in the air lifting as if the earth itself could finally breathe again. Rivers ran clear once more, their waters reflecting the pale light of dawn, and the twisted trees straightened, their leaves rustling with a gentle, hopeful rhythm. The scars of battle remained, but the land was healing, slowly but surely. Alara stood amidst the quiet, her body trembling from the strain, her spirit heavy with the weight of what she had done. She had succeeded, but the victory had come at a cost she hadn't fully anticipated. Her hands, still clutching the now dormant artifacts, were raw and blistered, her body aching with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. She felt hollow, as though the fight had drained not just her strength, but something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. The whispers, which had been her constant companions for so long, were gone, their absence leaving a strange void in her mind. For the first time in months, there was silence, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet she had hoped for. It was a silence that echoed with questions, doubts, and the lingering weight of her choices. As she sank to her knees, the spectral guardian appeared before her, its form shimmering faintly in the soft morning light. Its presence was different now, less imposing, almost gentle. "You have done well, Elara," it said, its voice carrying a warmth she hadn't heard before. "You faced the gods not just with courage, but with wisdom. And in doing so, you have grown stronger than you realize." Alara looked up, her eyes heavy with weariness, but still sharp with determination. "I didn't feel strong. she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt lost, like I was stumbling through the dark, hoping I was doing the right thing. The guardian's form flickered, its expression softening. Strength is not the absence of doubt, it said. It is the ability to move forward despite it. You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, and yet you never faltered. That is true strength, Alara. Her chest tightened at the guardian's words, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow welling up inside her. She had spent so long chasing the whispers, believing they were guiding her towards something greater. But now, in the silence, she realized the truth. The whispers had never been just the voices of the gods. They had been her own doubts, her fears, her deepest insecurities, echoing back at her from the void. They had pushed her, challenged her, and in the end, they had shown her who she truly was. The guardian's form began to fade, its light growing dimmer with each passing moment. Your journey has changed you, it said, its voice barely a whisper now, but it has also prepared you. The world still needs you, Elara, not as a hero, but as a guide. Use what you have learned to help others find their way. As the guardian vanished, leaving her alone in the quiet dawn, Alara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of her journey would never fully heal. But she was no longer the same person who had stumbled into the forest all those months ago, chasing whispers she didn't understand. She had faced the darkness, both within and without, and emerged stronger for it. With a deep breath, she stood, her legs shaky but steady. The artifacts lay beside her, their light extinguished, their purpose fulfilled. She left them there, a testament to what she had sacrificed and what she had gained. The whispers were gone, but their lessons remained, etched into her heart like the runes on the temple walls. She had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. As she turned and began to walk away, the sun rising behind her, Alara knew her journey was far from over. But she also knew she was ready. The whispers had guided her to this moment, but now it was her voice, her strength, her wisdom, that would guide her forward. The world was healing, and so was she, and in the silence she found not emptiness, but the quiet promise of a new beginning. The path back to the village was long and winding, each step carrying the weight of everything Alara had endured. The landscape, once scarred by chaos, now bore signs of renewal, crops sprouting in fields that had been barren, the sounds of laughter echoing where silence had once reigned. Yet, as she approached the familiar gates, her heart tightened with a mix of anticipation and dread. The people she had known all her life stood waiting, their faces a mosaic of emotions. Some looked at her with awe, their eyes shining with gratitude, while others wore expressions of distrust, their brows furrowed with lingering anger. It was a homecoming, but not the triumphant one she might have imagined. A child ran forward, tugging at her sleeve. "Are you the one who saved us?" they asked, their voice filled with wonder. Elara knelt, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. "I did what I could," she replied softly, her hand brushing their hair. Nearby, an older woman turned away, her arms crossed tightly. "Saved us," she muttered. "If it weren't for her, we wouldn't have needed saving in the first place." The words stung, but Alara didn't argue. She had carried that guilt with her every step of the way, and she knew it wouldn't fade overnight. Despite the mixed reactions, Alara found her place in the village once more. She began to share her story, not as a boast, but as a cautionary tale. In the evenings, she gathered the villagers around the fire, her voice steady as she recounted the whispers, the gods, and the sacrifices she had made. The children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations alight with the fantastical, while the adults exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism tempered by the undeniable proof of the world's healing. She spoke of the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned, her words a bridge between the past and the future. As the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The villagers who had once blamed her started to ask questions, their anger giving way to curiosity. "What did the gods say?" one man asked hesitantly. "Why did they try to destroy us?" Elara answered honestly, her voice gentle but firm. "They weren't trying to destroy us," she explained. "They were lost, just as we were. And in their pain, they lost sight of what mattered most. But we can learn from their mistakes, and ours." Her words resonated, slowly weaving themselves into the fabric of the village's collective memory. The rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Alara worked alongside her neighbors, mending fences and planting seeds, but also mending relationships and planting ideas. She showed them how to find strength in vulnerability, how to face the past without being consumed by it. The whispers, though gone, had left their mark, and Alara carried their wisdom in her heart. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was worth walking. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Alara stood at the edge of the village, gazing out over the fields. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the sounds of life, laughter, chatter, the clinking of tools filled the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long, and the scars would never fully fade, but she had found her way back, not just to the village, but to herself. As she turned to walk back to the fire, a young girl ran up to her, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," she said shyly, holding out the flowers. Alara accepted them with a smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. The whispers were gone, but their lessons lived on, in her, in the village, and in the stories she would continue to tell. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Alara knew she wasn't alone. The village, the world, and the whispers had all played their part in shaping her, and now it was her turn to shape what came next.